Part 1, The Convent on the Edge of the Harbor. The year was 1873 and Boston's harbor lay cloaked beneath a shroud of early morning fog, the kind that blurred the horizon and made the sea look like it was swallowing the sky. At the very edge of that fog stood St. Mirabel's Convent, a place so withdrawn from the rest of the city that even the most faithful parishioners rarely approached its gates. The convent's walls, built from gray stone and centuries of silence, rose like a fortress against the restless Atlantic wind. Locals said it was older than the city itself, built upon the ruins of a forgotten church whose name had been erased from every record. Within those walls lived a group of women who called themselves the Sisters of the Veil. They never left the convent. They never lifted their veils. Some said their faces were burned, others whispered that they had no faces at all. But the one thing everyone agreed upon was that St. Mirabel's was not a place for the curious. Yet curiosity was exactly what brought Clara Hensley there. She was 26. A historian from Harvard who had dedicated her life to unearthing the lost pieces of New England's religious history. When a letter arrived bearing the convent's wax seal, inviting her to catalog its ancient scriptures, she could hardly believe it. The invitation was unsigned, the handwriting elegant but trembling, as if written by someone afraid of being seen. "There are texts that must be preserved," the letter said, "but only you can read them." That single sentence haunted her, echoing through her mind as her carriage rattled down the cobblestone road toward the sea. When she arrived, the convent loomed before her like a shadow made solid. The iron gates creaked open without anyone touching them, and she stepped through, clutching her satchel of ink and parchment like a talisman. Inside, the air was colder, not the kind of cold that came from weather but from the absence of life. The halls were dim, lit by candles that never seemed to burn down. Every step Clara took echoed too long, as though the stones beneath her feet remembered every visitor who had ever dared to walk there. Then came the sisters. They moved soundlessly, their veils hanging heavy and opaque. None spoke. None looked at her. They seemed to drift rather than walk, and when they passed she smelled salt water, not the fresh kind from the sea, but something stagnant, old, and heavy. At last she was brought before the abbess. Her veil was thicker than the others, layered like mourning cloth, and when she spoke, her voice was calm but not kind. "Miss Hensley," she said, "you have been granted entry to our archives. You will see what no outsider has seen in 100 years. But you must not question what you find. You must not open what is sealed. And above all, when the bells toll at midnight, you must not leave your room." Clara nodded, though her pulse quickened. The abbess handed her a brass key and turned away. "The Lord rewards the faithful," she murmured, "and punishes the curious." That night, Clara sat in her small cell, staring at the key. Beyond her window, fog rolled across the cliffs like a living thing. Somewhere in the distance, the ocean roared, but beneath it, she swore she could hear voices chanting, soft and rhythmic, in a language she didn't recognize. Then came the bell. One chime. 2, 3. It continued until 12, then stopped. Clara exhaled, trembling. But before she could settle back into her bed, a 13th chime echoed through the convent. It was faint, almost accidental, but it didn't stop. The sound stretched and warped, becoming a low hum that vibrated through the floor. She rose, clutching the key, drawn as though by instinct toward the door. The hall was dark. Candlelight flickered at the far end, and a faint shape, a sister, drifted past, her veil brushing the stone. Clara followed, her footsteps silent. The sister led her to the chapel, a cavernous room lined with pews and crucifixes that had long since blackened with age. At the center stood the altar, carved from obsidian, glistening faintly like wet stone. And there, beneath it, Clara saw it. A small iron door, locked and marked with a symbol she had never seen before. A circle split by a cross, surrounded by letters that looked almost alive. Her key pulsed warm in her hand as though it recognized the seal. "Those who see the truth must never speak it," the sister whispered behind her, though when Clara turned, no one was there. She hesitated, then knelt and inserted the key. The lock clicked open, releasing a breath of air so cold it burned her lungs. The door creaked ajar, revealing a staircase descending into darkness. For a moment, Clara thought she heard the sea again, but it wasn't the sea. It was whispering. Hundreds of voices, layered and indistinct, rising from below. Her candle trembled. Her mind screamed to stop, to run, to obey the abbess's warning. But something stronger, curiosity, hunger, or fate, pulled her forward. She stepped down into the dark, each footfall echoing like a prayer she didn't mean to say. As the last of the candlelight vanished behind her, the whispers grew louder, forming words she couldn't understand. And for the first time since she arrived, Clara realized that St. Mirabel's convent wasn't built to protect the sisters from the world, it was built to protect the world from whatever was beneath it. Part 2, The Library Beneath the Altar. The descent into the dark felt endless, as if the staircase were coiling through the belly of something alive. Clara's candle sputtered, its flames struggling against the damp air that grew colder and thicker with every step. When she finally reached the bottom, she found herself standing before an arched doorway carved into black stone, the walls covered in symbols that seemed to shift when she tried to read them. Inside was a vast underground chamber, a library but not like any she had seen before. Shelves rose high into the shadows, filled not with books but with scrolls wrapped in animal skin, jars of blackened ink, and relics that pulsed faintly as if alive. The air hummed with a low vibration that seemed to come from the shelves themselves. In the center of the room stood a massive table, and upon it lay a single scripture bound in red thread, its pages so old they looked like they would crumble to dust if touched. Clara's hand trembled as she reached for it, remembering the abbess's warning, "You must not open what is sealed." But curiosity was no longer something she could fight, it had become part of her. The thread snapped with a sound far too loud for such a small motion, echoing through the chamber like a scream swallowed by stone. The pages inside were written in a language that made her vision blur. The words seemed to move, rearranging themselves every time she blinked. At the top of the first page, in black ink that shimmered like oil, were 3 words written in Latin, "Sanguis non dormit." Blood does not sleep. As she read the phrase aloud, the air changed. The candle flickered violently, and the temperature dropped so fast her breath turned white. From somewhere beyond the shelves came a faint, dragging sound, like feet moving slowly over stone. She turned, heart pounding, but saw nothing. Then she noticed something even more terrifying. Her candle was no longer the only light. Dozens of faint glows flickered between the shelves, dim and trembling as if held by unseen hands. The air filled with whispers, dozens of voices murmuring her name. "Clara!" The sound was not coming from one direction but from everywhere at once, weaving through the dark like a cold wind. She stumbled backward, clutching the scripture, but the moment she tried to close it, the pages refused to move. They fluttered on their own, faster and faster, until they landed on a page filled with drawings, faces, hundreds of them, screaming, each one marked with the same symbol she had seen on the iron door. Beneath them was a single line written in English as if waiting for her eyes. "The sisters do not pray, they guard." Suddenly the dragging sound returned, louder, closer. Out of the shadows emerged one of the sisters, her veil torn, revealing not a face but a void, black and pulsing like liquid shadow. Her hands were thin and pale, the fingers too long, trembling as they reached toward Clara. "It's awake," the voice gurgled, though her lips did not move. "You shouldn't have read it." Clara dropped the scripture and stumbled backward, her candle falling to the ground and dying instantly. The faint glows around the room began to rise, dozens of them, floating upward until they gathered near the ceiling. They weren't lights. They were eyes. Every one of them watching her. She turned and ran toward the staircase, her hands scraping against the cold stone, but when she reached the steps, they weren't there. The walls had shifted. The door she had entered through was gone. The library was closing in on itself, breathing, alive. Then she saw it, a figure standing at the far end of the chamber, holding the scripture she had dropped. It wore the veil of a sister, but its movements were wrong, too fluid, too quiet. The thing tilted its head, and from beneath the veil came the soft sound of pages turning. Clara's voice trembled as she whispered, "Who are you?" The figure raised a hand, and for the first time she saw the mark branded into its palm, the same circle and cross symbol from the iron door. "We were never allowed to die," it whispered, and all the lights went out. The next thing Clara knew, she was back in her cell, gasping, drenched in sweat, the brass key still clutched in her palm. Her candle burned calmly beside her, as if it had never gone out. The convent was silent. But on her desk lay a single red thread, and beneath it, a page torn from the scripture, the ink still wet. Part 3, the 13th Psalm. When Clara awoke the next morning, sunlight streamed faintly through her narrow window, though the warmth she expected never came. Her hands were still trembling, her mind trapped between memory and nightmare. The torn page from the scripture lay on her desk exactly where she'd left it, but the ink had changed. The words she'd seen the night before were gone, replaced by a single Latin phrase that hadn't been there before. Psalmus Tridicum, the 13th Psalm. But there were only 12 psalms in the convent's hymnal. She felt an instinctive dread, the kind of chill that comes when the air feels aware of you. Still, she tucked the page into her notebook, determined to find answers in daylight, the kind that reasoned men could explain. She found the abbess waiting in the dining hall, surrounded by silent sisters who ate nothing, their spoons unmoving. When Clara entered, the abbess lifted her veiled head, her voice smooth and unhurried. "You were warned not to wander," she said. "Did you?" Clara lied. "No, Mother Abbess." The abbess tilted her head as though listening to something only she could hear. "Lies carry weight here, Miss Hensley. The walls remember." Then, without another word, she rose and left the hall. The sisters followed, leaving Clara alone in the echo of their silence. Later, Clara found herself drawn to the chapel once more. It was brighter now, the stained glass casting fractured rainbows on the stone floor, though every color seemed muted, sickly. She knelt by the altar where the iron door had been, but it was gone, sealed over as if it had never existed. The floor beneath her felt different now, faintly warm. The whispers she'd heard the night before were silent, yet the silence itself seemed alive, thick, and waiting. She opened her notebook to study the page again, tracing the words Samus Tradisum with her finger. The ink shimmered faintly under her touch, and before her eyes, the letters began to rearrange themselves into English. "Those who die in silence shall rise in memory." Her heart hammered. She looked up and froze. The pews, empty moments ago, were now filled. Dozens of veiled figures sat motionless, their heads bowed, their hands clasped in prayer. The candlelight flickered against their veils, revealing faint outlines beneath, not faces but skulls, hollow and gray. Clara stumbled backward, whispering, "No, this isn't real." The air shifted. Every head turned toward her at once. Beneath their veils came the same whisper she'd heard before, layered and inhuman, "Samus Tradisum." The chapel door slammed shut behind her. The air grew heavy, the candle flames bending inward as though being sucked by an unseen force. Then one by one the sisters began to hum. It wasn't a hymn, it was a low, discordant vibration that shook the floor. The crucifix above the altar began to tremble, its wooden arms creaking until it split down the middle and fell. The humming stopped. The abbess appeared in the doorway at the far end, her veil fluttering though there was no wind. "You've seen too much," she said softly. "The scripture has chosen you." Clara's voice cracked. "What are you talking about?" The abbess stepped closer, the scent of salt water filling the air again. "It found your name long before you came here. Every century one must carry it, the memory of what cannot die. The bloodline must continue." Clara shook her head, backing away. "I don't understand." The abbess lifted her hand and pointed toward the altar. "You will." From beneath the stone, something moved. The floor bulged upward as though something massive pressed from below. Cracks splintered across the tiles and a faint, rhythmic thumping echoed, like a heartbeat beneath the earth. Clara dropped to her knees as the stone burst open, releasing a gust of freezing air that extinguished every candle in the room. Out of the darkness crawled a hand, pale, skeletal, wrapped in strands of red thread. It clutched the edge of the altar and pulled. The rest of it followed, a figure in a shredded veil, its skin paper-thin and ink-stained, its hollow eyes leaking black tears. "Samus Tradisum," it moaned, voice layered with centuries. The abbess turned to Clara. "The 13th Psalm is not sung," she whispered. "It's fed." Before Clara could scream, the veiled figures in the pews rose as one, their mouths opening in a silent cry, and the chapel plunged into total darkness. Part 4, The Burden of the Chosen. Clara awoke on the chapel floor, the scent of salt and iron heavy in the air. Her skin was damp, her dress clinging to her like she had been dragged from deep water. The pews were empty again, the cracked altar whole as if untouched, and the crucifix above it hung perfectly still. For a moment, she wondered if it had all been a dream, a fever from exhaustion, a trick of the mind born from sleepless nights and ghost stories whispered into her ears by the wind. But when she lifted her trembling hand, she saw it. Red thread. Wrapped around her wrist, tight enough to cut into her skin. She tried to remove it, but the more she pulled, the tighter it grew until the skin began to bleed. Beneath the thin trickle of blood, she saw it. Faint marks burned into her flesh, the circle and cross from the iron door. Clara staggered to her feet and ran through the convent halls, calling for the abbess, but her voice echoed back at her distorted, hollow, as if the stone walls were answering. The doors she passed were open now, cells that had once been sealed. Inside each one she saw the same thing. A small wooden table, a single candle, and a thin book bound in human hair. Every candle burned with a blue flame. Every book was open to the same page, a drawing of a veiled woman holding a bleeding child. Clara stumbled backward, her breath ragged. "This can't be real," she whispered, but even her own voice sounded like it belonged to someone else. Then came the bell. 12 tolls. Slow, deliberate, shaking the entire convent. But this time there was no 13th chime. Only silence, thick, suffocating silence. The sisters appeared again, drifting through the hall, their veils fluttering like drowned fabric. Their movements were synchronized, their heads bowed. Clara backed away, clutching her arm, but one of them reached out and touched her shoulder. Beneath the veil came a whisper so soft it felt like breath against her ear. "The scripture is inside you now." Panic surged through her. She turned and fled, down corridors that seemed to shift and loop upon themselves. No matter where she turned, she always ended up in the same place, the library beneath the altar. But now the shelves were gone. In their place stood dozens of wooden chairs arranged in a circle, and on each one sat a sister, their veils glistening wet as though fresh from the sea. The abbess stood in the center, holding the red-threaded scripture. Her voice was calm. "You've been chosen to continue our vow, Miss Hensley, to speak with the dead when we no longer can." Clara's voice cracked. "I don't want this. I didn't ask for it." The abbess tilted her head. "Neither did we. The bloodline chooses, not the will." She extended her hand, revealing a dagger with a blade as black as night. Its hilt was carved from bone, engraved with the same shifting symbols Clara had seen on the walls. "To seal the covenant," the abbess said, "you must drink from the past." Clara shook her head, stepping back. "You're all insane." But when she tried to move, she found her feet rooted to the floor. The red thread from her wrist had unraveled, stretching across the ground like veins, connecting her to the sisters, to the scripture, to the stone itself. The abbess's voice grew deeper, layered with others, the voices of generations. "You will speak with them now. You will remember what the world has forgotten." The candlelight dimmed and the air turned to frost. Shadows began to rise from the floor, tall and shivering, shaped like figures trapped between life and death. Their faces were pale and hollow, their mouths moving soundlessly. One of them stepped forward, a young girl with a rosary embedded in her skin. Her eyes were wide and pleading. "Set us free," she mouthed. Clara felt something break inside her. The thread pulsed, glowing faintly red. Her heartbeat synced with the whispers, faster and faster until pain consumed her. The scripture opened on its own, the pages flipping violently before stopping on a blank sheet. Ink bled through from nowhere, forming words that spelled her name. Clara Hensley. Then came the final line, "Bearer of the 13th Psalm." The abbess placed the dagger in Clara's trembling hand. "Now you understand," she said softly. "The living must pay for silence." The room began to tremble, dust falling from the ceiling as the sea's roar echoed through the walls. Clara screamed, the sound swallowed by the dark. The dagger slipped, cutting her palm, and the moment her blood touched the scripture, the whispers stopped. The sisters froze, every veil turning toward her in perfect unison. The abbess bowed her head. "It is done." But the look in her unseen eyes told a different story. The ritual was complete, yet something had gone wrong. Part 5, the 13th Psalm Lives. The storm outside had swallowed the coast. Thunder rolled over Boston's harbor like cannon fire, and St. Mirabel's convent groaned beneath the wind, its ancient stones trembling as if the earth itself wanted to forget what slept inside them. Clara stood at the altar, her palms still bleeding, the red thread now running from her hand to the scripture on the table, pulsing faintly like a vein. The abbess knelt before her, veil trembling, her voice thin and hollow. "It is written," she whispered. "The bearer of the 13th Psalm will awaken the sea of memory." Clara's breathing was uneven. She wanted to scream, to tear herself free, but the blood from her wound had soaked into the parchment, and the scripture seemed to move under her skin, literally. She could feel the ink crawling through her veins, spreading, whispering. The voices were no longer around her. They were inside her, speaking in tongues she shouldn't have understood but somehow did. They spoke of the sisters, of the vow, of the first woman who'd made the pact centuries ago, not with God but with something that watched from the deep. It was never faith that built St. Mirabel's. It was containment. A prison for a voice too old, too vast to ever die. "You called to it," said the abbess softly. "When you read the scripture you spoke its name. Now it will answer." The candles in the room extinguished all at once. The air thickened, pressing against her chest. From beneath the floor came a sound, not the beating heart from before but something heavier. What? Rhythmic. Breathing. The stone split open once more, the cracks glowing red like veins of molten rock, and the sound of waves filled the chapel though no water touched the shore. Then came the whisper, deep, layered, ancient. The kind that seemed to bypass hearing entirely and settle straight into her bones. Claire. Her name. spoken not as a question but as a claim. The abbess began to pray, her voice trembling, the words spilling into meaningless chants. The sisters joined her, their voices rising until the chapel shook. The wind outside screamed through shattered glass. Clara stumbled backward, clutching her head as pain erupted behind her eyes. Visions flooded her mind, not memories but lives. Dozens, hundreds of women, all veiled, all marked with the same red thread, all bound to the scripture through centuries. Each had carried it. Each had died for it. And each one whispered the same words, "The 13th Psalm lives through us." Her knees buckled. The abbess reached for her, but Clara recoiled. "Stop," she shouted, her voice breaking. "You knew this would happen." The abbess lowered her head. "It must continue. Without a vessel, it consumes the world." "Then let it," Clara screamed. "I won't be your cage." The scripture's pages began to tear themselves apart, the red thread unraveling faster than she could see, whipping through the air like living sinew. The sisters fell to the floor, convulsing, their veils igniting into flame that gave no light. The abbess tried to speak, but only blood poured from beneath her veil. The ground split open wider, revealing an abyss filled not with fire, but with eyes. Thousands of them, glimmering beneath the stone like stars under black water. A voice rose from below, impossibly deep. "The 13th has awakened." Clara's body froze. The red thread snapped, and for a brief, unbearable moment she felt everything, every death, every whisper, every prayer buried beneath the convent. Her vision filled with faces, hundreds of them, all screaming without sound. The sea roared. The walls of St. Mirabel's burst inward as if struck by invisible waves, and icy water flooded the chapel, dragging the sisters away into the dark. The abbess reached for Clara one last time. "Forgive us," she said before the current pulled her under. Clara screamed as the water swallowed her, the scripture dissolving in her hand like ash. Then silence. When she opened her eyes, she was lying on the rocky shore beneath the cliffs, dawn breaking faintly through the mist. The convent was gone. Only broken stone jutted from the earth like gravestones. Her clothes were dry. The wound on her palm was gone. But as she sat up, she saw it, faint just beneath the skin, the circle and cross, glowing softly before fading into her veins. A whisper brushed her ear, the same voice that had spoken her name. "The 13th does not end. It begins again." Clara turned toward the sea, the fog shifting with the sound of faint chanting drifting from somewhere deep below the waves. Her eyes filled with tears she couldn't explain. Then, slowly she began to smile. And as the morning light touched the shore, it revealed the truth that history would never record. The convent of St. Mirabel had never been destroyed. It had simply moved, beneath the sea, beneath time, waiting for the next voice willing to speak the 13th Psalm aloud.